I had the pleasure of John Berry's company for the first time in this posting in the quiet, discreet, intimate environment of a fully lit ABC television studio. Within a couple of weeks of John taking up the posting, he was a guest on my show, ABC News Breakfast. And as I discovered a bit later on, it wasn't quite the encounter he was expecting, having been conditioned to the more, how should I say, saccharine US breakfast TV shows. John was fully briefed on Australian furry animals, favourite cities, his favourite colour, and all that, of course, went out the window when Virginia and I pressed him on the rise of China, what was going on in Syria, US domestic politics and the like, but I'm pleased to say, as he always does in those sort of interviews, he handled himself with aplomb. He is certainly a very smart cookie indeed. I found out later, by the way, his favourite colour's blue. Or should that be red, white and blue? Now, John has thrown himself into the job of US Ambassador to Australia with enormous enthusiasm. He has travelled to most parts of the country, every state and territory since being here. He and Curtis have become very popular fixtures on the diplomatic circuit in Canberra as well. He's been right around the country, but I'm pleased to say Melbourne has a particular significance for John and his family, as I'm sure he'll tell you later on without too much prompting. The connection he and his family have with this city, and in particular with a certain iconic venue not too far from where we sit, is a very, very special one indeed. John has had a distinguished career in public service. Before coming to Australia, he was the director of the US Office of Personnel Management, directing a workforce of only 2 million Americans. I'm sure it was fairly easily managed. He was also for 4 years the director of the National Zoo in Washington, which prepared him very well for dealing with Australian politicians, I'm sure. Now, as the official representative for the Obama administration in Australia, as I said earlier, John has his hands very full, of course, with the impending G20 visit, the situation in Iraq, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and a whole lot more. Ladies and gentlemen, please warmly welcome the US Ambassador to Australia, John Berry.
Michael, thank you. That was very generous, and I'm especially honored to be here with your father, who is also carrying the Roland name at our table. So, John, it was really a great pleasure to meet you and to hear your stories at Washington, D.C. Thank you to the Melbourne Press Club for having me today. It is a great honor to be here with you, and as Michael says, this city has a very special personal significance to me. Not only was it my first official trip outside of Canberra when I arrived a year ago, my father in World War II fought at Guadalcanal. And my dad, we grew up at his knee hearing this story of, after spending 6 months on Guadalcanal as a young 18-year-old, he wondered, as long with many of his colleagues who had survived, whether there was any good left in the world. And after surviving Guadalcanal, they brought them here to Melbourne. And the Marine 1st Division of the United States Marine Corps was housed on the cricket ground. And my dad said that Australians were so warm-hearted, were so generous in their welcome, so kind and true that in less than a week's time, it not only reminded you that there was good left in the world, but that it was damn well worth fighting for. And back into the fight they went, up into Papua New Guinea alongside Australians. And lest you think it's a sentimental, because berries are pretty sentimental, that it's not just my dad's recollection. When the 1st Division sailed into Melbourne Harbor, the band struck up Waltzing Matilda. It was such an emotional moment for every one of the young men on that ship that heard those strains, that to this day, 2014, over 70 years later, whenever the 1st Marine Division of our U.S. Marine Corps ships out, they do so to the strains of Waltzing Matilda. So it gives you a sense of just the emotional impact that was had that day when they sailed into your beautiful harbor. Our alliance since that period has been the cornerstone of peace and security here in the Asia Pacific. Australia's leadership and support has been crucial to advancing our shared interest both regionally and around the globe. Our alliance is strong. It is enduring. It is one of the United States' most important partnerships in the world. We have worked and we have fought side by side. In times of war and in times of peace, we turn to each other. We are not allies because of geography. We are not allies out of obligation. We are allies because we share the foundational values of liberty, justice, democracy, human dignity, and freedom. We are also allies because neither one of us ever walks away from our friends. In our darkest days, we have stood together, and that is proof that we always will. When you came under attack and your homeland was assaulted in World War II, we were there before we had a treaty, just as you were there on September 11th for us. We remember. From security to space, from investment to trade and innovation, from humanitarian assistance to conservation, you will not find a truer friend, a stronger ally, or a more dependable and dedicated partner than the United States. Now, earlier this year, I spoke at the National Press Club in Canberra, and we focused there on the U.S.-Australian alliance. And just as a quick update, before I turn to the topic of today's core speech, we focused there on the rebalance in our alliance. I want to assure everyone in the room the United States is committed to our rebalance here in the Asia Pacific. Next month, the President will visit China for the APEC leaders meeting. He will then be on to Burma for the East Asia Summit, and then here in Brisbane for the G20. His visits will help us strengthen ties, increase and improve understanding, and expand cooperation through these valuable partners and institutions. But U.S.-Australian cooperation extends far beyond the boundaries and borders of the Asia Pacific. So what I'd like to spend my time talking with you today about is what we're doing together outside of the region, or issues that we're involved with that affect the region but also have a broader global implication. In an increasingly interconnected world, we ignore seemingly distant problems at our peril. From Ukraine to Iraq, from West Africa to Syria, we are working together on behalf of peace and to help fight aggression and terror in troubled countries that are far from both our homes. We are working to combat deadly diseases that recognize no borders, and we are tremendously grateful for Australia's great leadership. We welcome Australia's leadership and contributions and its willingness to do more in the fight against Ebola and the associated humanitarian crisis that we are undertaking in West Africa. This is a global problem, and it requires a global response. Working with the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and other partners, we have the best chance for a short window to contain this disease and control its spread before it spreads out of West Africa. Our United States Department of Defense recognizes this issue as one of the most important of the day. They are devoting over $1 billion to this fight. They are constructing up to 17 medical treatment Ebola units. Almost 4,000 U.S. service members are en route to assisting West Africa and in doing what we can to control this deadly outbreak. Australia's leadership at the G20, which is only, I think, 17 days away, is an unprecedented opportunity for our most senior leaders to come together to look at not only how can we finish up once and for all the great financial crisis that the world has come through, but also create the jobs, the growth, and the high-paying jobs that will ensure the security for our economic future. And then finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about our cooperation in research and innovation. And especially touch, as Michael said, I've been involved in conservation throughout all of my life. I'd like to talk a little bit at the end about how we can conserve our planet's precious natural resources. Now, since the 6 decades since we signed the ANZUS Treaty, our world has dramatically changed. It is not the same world. As the world changes, so must our security cooperation. Now, our cooperation involves the global commons of space and of cyberspace, areas that were not even were not known at the time we signed the original ANZUS Treaty, but both areas vital to our security in this day and age. We work together to promote regional cooperation, to reinforce rules and norms that will keep our people safe. We are working to make sure that disputes, when they arise, are settled diplomatically and on the basis of international law. We train together our people so that we are prepared to help countries when they are struck by natural and humanitarian disasters. When crises happen, we work together to find our people and bring them home. Together, we are searching for the final resting place of MH370. We are cooperating to bring home the remains of those killed on MH17 and to hold responsible those who caused their deaths. We will continue to work together to stop terrorism wherever we find it. And that is especially necessary when we are speaking of criminals and terrorists who are willing to target civilians, behead journalists and aid workers for propaganda purposes, and who are prepared to strike anywhere, anytime. We are committed to disabling ISIL because it poses not just a threat to the people of Iraq, Syria, and the broader Middle East, but we believe to people around the world. And so, at the request of the Iraqi government, Australia and the United States are standing together once again as part of a broad international coalition of over 60 nations. Think of it, 60 nations have come together in this fight to take on this especially brutal and barbaric terrorist criminal organization. Violence, extremism that brooks no differences, and radicalization are threats to the security of all nations. The good news about the coalition that has been formed is that it demonstrates hope very clearly. And in New York last month, Secretary Kerry pointed out a photo that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. It shows the Sunni foreign minister of Saudi Arabia arm in arm with the Kurdish president of Iraq and the Shia foreign minister of Iraq. People of many nations have come together and set aside their traditional differences of politics, of faith, of history to face this threat. And it is not just a military fight. It is a fight that we plan to take on many fronts. If we are to succeed, we must deny ISIL recruits, funding, and safe haven. The phenomenon of large numbers of fighters traveling to and from conflict zones is really unprecedented. So this is not an issue that can be solved by one country taking action alone. And that is why the President went in a very historic way to the United Nations to chair the Security Council last month to specifically discuss this problem. And at that meeting, the President, the Prime Minister, and other leaders discussed how they could interrupt the flow of terrorist fighters as well as disrupt their financing. The UN resolution on foreign terrorist fighters was adopted unanimously. Unanimously. That does not happen often in our world today. And that is a very good sign and a very good beginning. The keys to long-term success in the effort to counter ISIL are unity, sharing of information, and intelligence. We have got to stay one step ahead of our common enemy. And it is our partnership, the partnership between the United States and Australia, that is setting an example of just how this work can be done. Recently, the actions that were taken here in Melbourne were a result of cooperation between our FBI, your AFP, and the Victoria Police, and it was all on full display right here in Melbourne. And it has resulted in the disruption of the financial network that is supporting these terrorist organizations. Now, I don't want you to think our partnership is only about defense and security. So let's turn to some of the other important elements of our relationship. This year, in your capacity at the G20, is one of the focuses is on economic growth. And the United States believes one of the key elements in that economic growth picture is the conclusion of the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership that Michael referred to. Next year, we will finally celebrate the 10-year anniversary of our free trade agreement, our bilateral free trade agreement between our two countries. It's been a good news story. Doesn't get much press, but we have doubled the amount of trade, direct trade, between Australia and the United States. It now exceeds $60 billion a year, which is an amazing accomplishment when you stop to think that that growth trajectory happened amidst the global financial crisis. So you can imagine what will happen when times come back to the good times again. In the first 6 years alone, the number of Australian companies operating in the U.S. has doubled. The agreement has been such a success that we really want to build on it, and that's one of the cornerstones in the TPP. We want to try to create a system of trade where all countries in the region have access to an investment environment that is open, honest, and fair for all parties. TPP is ambitious. It will include strong protections for workers, the environment, intellectual property, and innovation. It will promote green and innovative technologies. It will improve the coherence of our regulatory systems and our supply chain efficiencies. And as Michael said, this weekend may well have been a breakthrough. And we are very hopeful, as both Minister Robb and Ambassador Froman have both said, that they believe we might be able to conclude this trade agreement by the end of the year. And so I know right now the working staff have stayed on for the week following in Sydney, and that's a good indication because that has not happened before. So I think we are in what may be the final hard yards of this agreement. Now, I know President Obama, as Michael said, is coming here next month, and he is very excited to be back. It will be a great opportunity for him to talk about strong growth, about sustainable growth, about balanced growth, about equity in terms of for future engagement of women and equality in our workforces, about energy efficiency, about climate change, and the participation of women in our workforce. So while we are successfully emerging, the United States, from the global financial crisis, and you all managed to avoid it, we need to start to think about how to take your good luck and our efforts together to help the global economic recovery gain steam. At the present, the United States has experienced 55 consecutive months of job growth. We've added 10 million jobs to our economy since the president took office. But we still have too many unemployed, and we have too many underemployed. And as Labor Secretary Perez, who was here in Melbourne last month for the Labor Secretary's ministerial meeting of the G20, said, we work best when we field a whole team. Now, we know that that is not just a United States problem. So we are anticipating very robust discussions in Brisbane on how do we create those jobs? How do we create better jobs, higher paying jobs for the future? And it will come to no surprise that one of the things the president thinks is one of the answers to that question is in climate and energy. G20 members comprise about 85% of the world's economic output. That's an impressive statistic, but it also means that they represent 80% of the world's carbon emissions as well. And the world's largest economies, some of its biggest polluters, the United States included, we need to be in a good position to lead by example. And I have said before, right here in Melbourne earlier this year, that good climate policy and good economic policy can go hand in hand. Dealing with the effects of climate change, whether we're talking from property infrastructure to crop losses or increased energy costs, if we can avoid those things, we will save ourselves billions of dollars. And that is why the president has made this a critical component of our economic recovery as well. At home, we're investing in clean energy. We have cut our carbon pollution more than any other country in the world in the past 8 years. And at the same time, we're creating new jobs. The president pledged originally to reduce our carbon emissions by 17% by 2020. We have hit 11% now, so we're over halfway there. And to make sure that we keep going and again provide that leadership for the discussions which will be coming next year in Paris, where each nation will step up to the plate, we hope, and make a commitment for what they'll do between now and 2030. The president has committed that we'll raise reduction of our emissions of our power plants by 30% by 2030. Now, the good news is that effort did just what we'd hoped to do. The EU, you know, just last week, stepped up to the plate and said, well, if you're doing 30, we'll do 40. Great. That is exactly the kind of competition we wanted to spark. And we want to also put a stake in the heart of one of those complaints that we regularly hear, that somehow making these changes will be too expensive, that it will hurt economic growth. We hear that it can't be done because of that. But what we have found with our companies and their engagement on this effort, good environmental practices go well and hand in hand with good economic practice. Google, one of our most successful companies, has put $1.5 billion into wind and solar projects around the world. And those investments have created jobs and they're decreasing their costs. Coke, Pepsi, General Mills are all working to reduce their impacts on the environment by increasing their uptake of renewables, changing how they handle their supply lanes, and changing their packaging and weight. In the end, the economic impact of avoiding these changes will be far more serious than undertaking them. And they can have impacts not only on our pocketbooks, but our national security as well. The head of our Pacific Command, Sam Locklear, Admiral Locklear, identifies climate change as one of the top long-term security challenges in the Pacific Ocean. And if we do not act, we will face serious consequences, not only to public health and safety, but to national security and economies. Every nation, developed and developing, needs to be part of the global effort for the sake of future generations. And so we congratulate and applaud EU's action of last week. I also applaud China's action that they have taken with us to reduce a historic record level of HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. It is a great step forward and shows that if we come together, we can change this. And I am reminded when I was the age of some of the students back here, at that time our ozone hole was evaporating. It was a great example of where the world can come together and make a huge difference. It was evaporating because of aerosols that we were using, CFCs that were breaking down the ozone, which protects us from the sun's radiation. We banned those internationally, and the hole is healing. But it is also a great counsel to all of us today. That action was taken almost 30 years ago, and it still has not healed completely. It will be another generation before it rebuilds itself in full. So it is not too late, but we must act. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about innovation, because it's critical to how we can solve these problems and still maintain economic growth. Funding of STEM education and investment in research. I'm so glad to see Monash here, one of the leading research institutions in the world. And it is because of innovation that we are big believers in the United States. It's one of the key critical elements in our economic success. We believe it will help us to face the challenge of an uncertain climate, aging population, and a changing energy landscape. Innovation can help us to find cures for the devastating diseases that we are facing in this day and age. It can provide clean water, plentiful food, and safe housing to billions of people living on this fragile planet. And sometimes the new ideas are easy to come up with, but that's not the whole equation we're trying to tackle. Connecting the good idea with the market and then scaling it to the right level is a key challenge. And so to try to help us work on that together, I have launched a series of what we call innovation roundtables. And at these roundtables, we bring together students like we've got here, but we also bring together researchers from government, from the private sector. We bring together business leaders. We bring together investors. We bring together all of the communities that are necessary to make innovation successful, not only in coming up with the idea, but making it work through the marketplace. And we've held one now in Canberra and one in Brisbane, which we highlighted with the governor there around the G20. And our next one will be right here in Melbourne. So I hope you all will look forward to helping us to launch that in the new year here in Melbourne. Our cooperation in research and development spans all of the things that we were talking about: universities, government, think tanks, corporations. And it's not just, like I said, new technology. It's also about developing new techniques. It's new processes, how we approach problems, that we can create solutions. And I believe that that is why innovation is also essential for conservation as well. Conservation is one of those things that Michael says, as I mentioned, is very near and dear to my heart. Recently, I don't know if you noticed it, it was buried on page A26, I think, of the New York Times. The World Wildlife Fund did a study looking at what's happened to the world's wildlife since 1970. Since 1970, when I was sitting in those chairs where you are, we have lost 52% of our world's wildlife. 52% of our world's wildlife. If that is not an F on our report card, I do not know what is. Clearly, whatever we're doing ain't enough. Clearly, we need to try new ways and new methods. And that's where new ideas and innovation comes into play. Our U.S. Geological Survey, one of our great scientific institutions, is using satellites and geolocators, working with Australian researchers and Chinese researchers to track bird migration routes. And the information that they're able to monitor from space is helping scientists understand how the birds are being impacted not only by climate change, but by habitat loss and disease. One of our recent Fulbright alumni, Robert Mason, who is studying coral reef bleaching at the University of Hawaii in Manoa, is working on ways to predict when reefs are becoming stressed and are at the risk of bleaching events, so that using satellite remote sensors, we can more carefully monitor and measure our responses so that we can protect and preserve these precious natural resources. One of the things I've been involved with recently has been gathering specialists as I meet going around Australia who care about conservation, together with conservation leaders from the United States. In August, I got to go to the Australian Wildlife Conservancy's Wildlife Reserve, their wilderness camp in Mornington, up in the Kimberley, out in West Australia. Their efforts there, they are undertaking what may be the largest attempt to fence in an area to keep out invasive species like cats and foxes, and then removing the cats and foxes in that area. And what they have found, and what was amazing to see, is the great recovery of your native species that all evolved, obviously, without these invasives. So the bilbies, the wallabies, the rock wallabies, the ground nesting birds, that all evolved not to face the threats of cats and foxes, when given that little inch, have run with it. And there have been great recoveries. And so Australia there is a great example of innovation. You are doing it on a scale that, quite frankly, everybody else in the world has thought impossible to accomplish. And the fact that you are breaking the way on that is making people sit up and listen and say, you know what? Why aren't we trying this? And so it is a great example of Australia's leadership in helping craft what may be a new way on reversing that trend, that F on our report card, of losing half the world's wildlife. Next month in Sydney, you will also host not only the G20, but you will host the World Parks Congress. Only happens every 10 years. But conservation leaders from around the world will be coming together in Sydney to discuss some of these issues. And I hope and I look forward to being there to be sharing. Our Secretary of Interior, Sally Jewell, is going to be coming out. And we're going to be working together. Our Director of our Park Service, John Jarvis, is coming out. We will be talking about this, and I think we have a model that America will benefit greatly from based on Australia's experience. So in conclusion, working together has never been our problem. Even when we disagree, we always manage to find common ground and a way forward, because we are more than just allies. Ours is not a one-dimensional alliance. I love that our first treaty with you was not the ANZUS Treaty. It was the Fulbright Treaty, set up to take the surplus war material of World War II and sell it. And in the biblical adage of taking our war material and beating it into plowshares, the sword into plowshares, that's what the Fulbright program did. Since then, it just celebrated its 65th anniversary of a partnership between Australia and the United States. Over 5,000 students, researchers, fellows have gone back and forth between our cultures, solving untold problems, building an innovation in ways that has improved human health. I draw great strength that our relationship began on that foundation. We are the closest of friends. We are bound by history, blood, and beliefs. We are family because we will stand side by side and defend each other whenever either of us is threatened. We both know that we cannot take our liberties for granted. Each generation must nurture, cherish, and protect them. The more that I learn, and this is aimed especially at our students, the more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. And as I age, there is precious little that I would hold for certain. But I know this. As long as our history endures, the United States and Australia will remain firmly committed to the values of freedom, justice, human dignity, and freedom. Long may it be so. May God bless our every effort, and may God bless our two great nations. Thank you so much. Michael?
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you. Let's ask some questions. I think you'd all agree that was a fantastic speech, and I have to say, every time you tell that story about your dad and his connection to Melbourne, it moves me tremendously. We do have some time for questions. I'd like to give priority to some working journalists in the room, then I'll throw the floor open. So please, we have a roving microphone at the back. If you have an organisation you're affiliated to, please say your name and that too. So who's going to open the batting?
Hello there, I'm Matt Dunkley from Business Day at the Age and the Morning Herald. Curious to know whether you agree, there's some talk about the China Infrastructure Investment Bank, whether you agree that Australia signing up to that would potentially place a strain on the relationship with the United States. Would it be a problem?
Well, I will tell you this. I think, well, first, Australia has to make its own decisions. Let me tell you what the United States' concern is with the bank. We are supportive of more resources going into infrastructure. We are very supportive of increasing the amount of resources going into infrastructure because it can help on the goal that we all share of increasing growth and jobs. It's one of the reasons we're pushing the Asian Development Bank to increase their investment by 40%, and the World Bank is going to double their investment in terms of these efforts in the years ahead. What we are concerned with, and so we welcome, additional efforts in this regard. We're involved in discussions with China about key concerns that go to issues of governance, transparency, how debt stability would be managed with countries, how this bank will, as it undertakes its way, will nest and coordinate with the existing multilateral investment structures that are out there. And so we're working closely with China to try to resolve those questions and those issues. Those are the same questions and issues that I know a number of our allies share as well, Japan and Australia particularly. Now, I will say this, that the China appointed the new director, most recently, has just been in the past couple of weeks, and the gentleman they appointed is a very a good man, a sharp man who understands these institutions. So we took that as a very good sign and as a good step forward. And so we're going to continue our discussions with China. We don't believe that you need to join an organization to define these rules. In fact, our experience in multilateral organizations is that if you wait to change the rules after you're in the game, your probability of success will be far lower than if you make sure you use your bargaining leverage before joining the game. And so that's exactly what the United States is doing. We are engaged in active discussions to see if we can resolve those issues, to ensure that if we're going to be investing resources, it can be handled transparently, carefully, and be responsibly integrated with the other infrastructure investment efforts that are going on around the world.
Next. Good, that means I can get to ask a question. And also I encourage the students at Kilvington to please just get up and ask a question. You mentioned the G20, President Obama is going, but also Vladimir Putin. And what are your thoughts on what world leaders should do, if not shirt front him there? Should they at least give him the cold shoulder over Russia's actions in Ukraine?
Well, you know, they are difficult conversations, and I suspect as the world leaders meet with President Putin, you know, Russia's actions in Ukraine and in the Crimea, and eastern Ukraine and the Crimea, since World War II, there has been an understanding among nations, and it's been one of the guiding principles. It was why the United Nations was created, was that we should not alter national boundaries through the use of force. And Russia has violated that key principle of international goodwill. So it can't be ignored. And that's why America and Australia have stood together with both sanctions, targeted sanctions. We're not sort of using a blunderbuss. We're targeting the sanctions. We're targeting individuals to make sure that we can have an incentive for Russia to join the world family of good international behavior again. Now, because obviously in Australia suffering the terrible loss on MH17 that was suffered and the Australians who were killed in that flight, there is no question in our mind that Russia was involved in that way. Whether it was through indirectly by arming the separatists so that they could take the action that ended up in the downing of this plane, or potentially even worse. But in any scenario, it is a scenario that calls out for an apology, it calls out for making it right, and it calls out for redressing the situation which created the environment in which that incident happened, which was their violation of good international law and order. And so they will be difficult conversations, but they are important conversations. And my prayer is they be constructive conversations, because you know, Russia has pledged. They have pledged and are making some good steps in terms of removing their troops from East Ukraine. We'll see. Our relationship with Russia over many years has taught us don't trust what is said, trust what is done. And we're waiting to see what is done. And I'm sure one of the things the President will be discussing with President Putin, as I'm sure the Prime Minister will be, is what future steps will be taken to continue the progress and the momentum that we're moving forward that will ultimately recognize the independence and the sovereign boundaries of Ukraine. Okay?
Yeah, Robert. Oh, sorry, yeah, Andrew Holden, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, John Andrew Holden from The Age. I'm sure you'll forgive an unfair question to a diplomat. You say you congratulate and applaud China on its position on climate change. How would you describe your response to Australia's policies?
You know, Australia is, the commitment that has been made by this government, in our view, equals the commitment that was made by the last government in terms of the goal. Where the United States focuses is not on the specific steps within each national boundaries that people take and how they reach the goal. That's the sovereign will of that country's prerogative. What we're focused on is having a good goal, because it's essential. If everybody has a good goal, then when you add them all up, you'll end up with a brighter result. And so next year is a critical year. So we don't have a problem with where Australia is now, because we see it as very much where Australia has been. But what we're hoping, and we're working very closely with the government and the ministers and the Prime Minister and others, to see what we can do to have a new goal for 2015 in Paris, which will up the ante. It will increase Australia's contribution and pledge towards environmental climate change. And as I tried to argue in the speech, in doing so, you can still have growth and jobs. These do not need to be antithesis of each other. And so our hope is we're going to work very hard, and I know the President has raised that with the Prime Minister already in their one-on-one meeting in the Oval Office earlier this year. Excuse me. And he will be following through on that until we meet in Paris in 2015. But that will be really the make or break date. And our hope is, and our focus with our relationship with Australia is, come on, let's do better. Just like we moved our goal from 17 to 30%, and Europe went to 40, you know, we can do better. And we can lead best by leading by example. And Australia is an important country in the world, and their contribution to that is one we all anticipate and have our fingers crossed. So I'm hopeful for next year that Australia will step up to the plate.
Robert Gottlieb's.
Yes.
Robert Gottliebson from Business Spectator. One of the great pillars of our ANZUS alliance is that it moves forward from step to step. If we go forward 10 years, we will face an Indonesia with one of the most modern air forces in the world, equipped by the Russian-Indian planes. The JSF we're buying has deep problems. Will the US consider recommencing production of the F-22 and give us access to it?
You know, much of the story on the Joint Strike Fighter is older information. It is a developmental program, and you have to understand, and probably it is the most complicated weapon systems ever undertaken by the human race. And so it is groundbreaking in that regard. I'll tell you, we have been, you know, we have not tried to hide the problems as they've occurred. And the general who's in charge of this, if you've ever gotten to meet him, is brutally frank, and has pulled no punches in terms of when this program has slipped or screwed up. And one of the reasons I remain confident in this is I've talked with that general, and this is a man who I believe we can trust. If you talk to him now, he will tell you that, you know, we have worked through most of those problems. And as one of the things we value about Australia being a developmental partner in that fighter plane is it's allowed us to work through those problems together. So your pilots are now in Texas already flying the JSF. And so, you know, we're hopeful that you know, that when this program is ready for full time and front time, and the developmental phase is wrapped up, it will be ready to face any challenge of the modern world. So, you know, as to the F-22, you know, I would have to defer that question to the Defense Department. I just I don't know enough to know whether they would consider that. But we're confident that the JSF will work, that it will not only work, but it will be an unbeatable plane in the 21st century. Yeah, but as I said, no, you're exactly right. And the general, you know, talked about that. They've gone through that. They've done an exhaustive you know, takedown of that. And before, obviously, that plane was allowed to fly with the Australians in it, that review had to be completed. So, you know, again, that's an old story, not a new story. So, but it's been resolved, in other words. So that's the view that we have. I know you're shaking your head, but the general who's in charge of this program has told me that that problem has been resolved.
John Masanauskas, Herald Sun. Just picking up before what you were talking about Putin and MH17, and it said it calls for an apology. Would you like to see President Putin apologise when he comes to Australia?
I think it's always a good beginning, and it would be a good place to start. You know, nothing will bring back those lives. Nothing will fill the hole that those families now suffer. But the best way that the world can move forward is through a recognition of responsibility. And the beginning of that would be an apology. So it's, I wouldn't say it is the last step. It would be a damn good first step.
Watch out, John, you've got a student now at
Uh-oh.
Kilmington.
That's a tough one.
Do you believe that local troops on the ground and US-led coalition airstrikes are enough to help combat the global threat of ISIS?
Good question.
I'm sorry, what was the end of the question? I heard the first part.
Do you think that the local troops and the airstrikes are going to be enough to help combat ISIS?
Time will tell. Right now, the approach we're taking with ISIS has sort of, a couple of angles of attack. Obviously, we're adding air power into the equation. We are also working with Australia to better train and provide better leadership within the Iraqi forces that will provide the ground troops necessary to retake the land and the ground that was lost. You can't retake ground from the air. It's got to be done by troops on the ground. And we are very confident that the new government in Iraq is successfully involving all of the three major communities of Iraq, the Shia, the Sunni, and the Kurds. And together, those three communities can defeat ISIS. And with us helping from the air, with us helping from supplies, with us helping through intelligence, with us helping through advice and assistance on the ground, we'll be able to help make their troops on the ground much more effective. Now, those are the first two elements of it. The second two we kind of touched on in the speech, which is we've got to turn off the tap for more foreign fighters going to these countries that just increase the number of people that you'd have to be dealing with. And then finally, you've got to also turn off the tap to the finances that are allowing them to buy the equipment and pay their soldiers and do what they're doing. And so it's a four-pronged strategy, and I would even add a fifth, and that is we need to, they're very successful propagandists, and they are spreading a message that has a pseudo appearance that makes it attractive to certain people in the world. But it is not a message that any religion in the world would support. And all nations, and I think this is where it's important that the 60 nations that are coming together have got to pull the mask off this animal and show it for what it is. I had lunch yesterday with the Egyptian ambassador along with 11 ambassadors from the Middle East, all from Islamic countries. Not one of them would recognize ISIS as an Islamic organization. I hate to use ISIS because it implies that they are Islamic. They're not. We're all children of the book in the West. We all have Abraham as our father. And the words that we revere in all three of the Western traditions, whether it's Judaism, Islam, or Christianity, are words of mercy, of forgiveness, of love, and of peace. They are not words of violence. They do not condone the taking hostages of people and beheading them for their beliefs. They do not condone, no religion, killing someone's wife or husband so that you can take their wife into slavery, taking children into slavery, into sexual slavery. These are horrific crimes. They are criminals, and they must be addressed before they grow and become too strong and become more difficult. We've learned from previous generations, you cannot look away from evil. It's got to be addressed. It's got to be resolved. And so that's the angle of attack we're working. It's just at the beginning phase. This is going to be a long effort. This is not going to be over in weeks. You know, our modern age makes us impatient. This should be wrapped up by now. This is going to be a longer fight. So that gives you the elements of how we hope the fight will bring about victory. Okay?
Tony.
Mr. Ambassador, Tony Wright from The Age, or Fairfax Media as we're called these days. I'll just diverge from the book for a moment. With the G20 coming up, one of the big areas of discussion will be global taxation. You spoke of trans-Pacific trade, and you spoke glowingly of a number of companies which had at least their genesis before becoming multinationals in the United States and still have their headquarters there. Australia has a bit of a revenue problem, and part of that revenue problem is associated with the fact that these very large US-based or US genesis companies don't pay any tax here or pay very little tax. I just wonder how committed at the G20 the United States will be to confronting that difficulty for countries like Australia, which are doing without revenue from those companies, and how committed you are at home to giving those companies a little bit of a shove along to be better international citizens.
I think it's a great question, and it is one that the finance ministers have been wrestling with over the course of the year. And there is combined support for a notion of fairness in an international tax system that shouldn't be allowed to be gamed. You know, the actions that Ireland took recently to change their rules to prevent sort of havens that can be misused by some companies. I'm very pleased that this year the U.S., based on negotiations between Treasurer Hockey and our Secretary of Treasury, Jack Lew, negotiated an agreement, and we signed a willingness to share information about the tax practices of both of our countries so that we can understand better and ensure that people are paying their fair taxes under both of our systems of laws. So it will make it harder for people to play games. Now, there is much that remains to be done in this area, and it is a complicated area because it does affect national laws, sovereign laws of each country. And so the G20 is the right forum to begin those discussions and to take the first important steps. I know it'll be one of the things on the agenda. It's been very well discussed this year. There's already been some action, as I said, taken, but there's a lot that remains to be done. And so I know it will be part of the discussions in Brisbane. As to what specifically might come out, I have to defer to for 16 days for us to see what that'll be.
Stephen Drill from the Herald Sun.
Yes.
You spoke of the $1 billion and the 4,000 troops that America is sending to West Africa. What's your view on Australia's response? We're refusing to send health workers to that area.
Well, you know, each country has to choose how they want to respond to these issues. We are very grateful for Australia's financial contributions of over $18 million that you all have put into the international fray. And I know the government is looking at doing more. The key is, and I know the government appreciates this point, and that is we have a window of opportunity whereby we can contain this disease. That window, you know, no one can tell you when it expires, when a tipping point is. No scientist can say, oh, you've got 6 weeks. But we know it is not forever. And there will come a point where this disease, if allowed to, will break out. And if it does, it will break out like polio, like AIDS. And if we think it's expensive to address now, wait until that happens. We will spend a generation, untold thousands, if not millions of lives lost, and trillions of dollars to get that genie back in the bottle. And we will spend a generation ruining the day that we did not step up with every ounce of effort and energy to contain this when we could. That is where we are. We are in when we could. Shame on us if we missed the opportunity. So everybody needs to be looking at, are we doing enough? Can we do more? Can we stretch? Can we add? Can we increase? Now is the time. Not 2 months from now, not 4 months from now. That may be too late. So we've got to seize the opportunity we have in front of us. It is a rare opportunity. It is a precious opportunity. And like I say, shame on us if anybody doesn't take full advantage of it. We are grateful for Australia's initial response. I know all of the ministers are working very hard on this. We are working closely with them to see what more can be done. We welcome more. We welcome more from everybody. We welcome more from the United States. We need to do it, and we need to do it now.
And a final question over here.
Mr. Ambassador, 6 degrees of separation. You talked about your dad visiting Australia. My father was a Lancaster bomber pilot during the Second World War.
Oh, really?
But my mother, who turned 100, or would have been 100 2 days ago, tells the story. I remember vividly about her and her sisters going to the MCG to put posters out to meet American soldiers and welcome them back to their homes. My mother tells a story about sitting around the piano and the Americans singing and
How wonderful.
doing all that wonderful stuff. So we're very, very inextricably connected, aren't we? But to my question, you talked about the people of the book. And Sir John Monash is up there on that board. The Australian Jewish community has made extraordinary contribution to our country in all areas, academic, medical, research, scientific, judiciary, and of course, militarily. I'm interested in your views or comment, and I know it can only be a comment, about the role Israel can play in this current dreadful situation that's occurring in the Levant particularly, and the link that, the close, extraordinary link that Israel has with America. Would you care to comment?
Absolutely. You know, Israel is a great friend of the United States, and I know they treasure their friendship with Australia as well. You know, and Israel shares all of our concerns and are one of those coalition partners that is looking at what they can do to help combat this criminal effort and this terrorist organization. You know, I think one of the things that we're very hopeful, and Secretary Kerry has spent a very significant portion of his secretaryship, is, you know, we can't forget that also, you know, the tensions between the Arab world and the Israeli world in the Middle East are part of this equation. And we need to, we can't ever turn our backs on peace. My dad was Irish. His mom came from Connemara in Ireland. When I was growing up, just like these kids, no one ever imagined peace would ever come to Ireland. It was a blood feud. Every family had lost somebody, and everybody knew somebody that was involved, and it was ankle deep in blood. And it was so old, so many U.S. politicians trying to help. Tip O'Neill, Ted Kennedy, you know, coming up in my lifetime, all ending in dismal failure with egg on their face. And people just kept saying, it can't be done, it can't be done. It was done. It's working. It's holding. and Ireland is at peace. If it can happen in Ireland, it can happen in the Middle East. And we believe, as the Secretary believes, that Arabs working with Israelis can resolve this ancient conflict. We can build a future that is, imagine if we spent, the United States is committing another $500 million to helping to rebuild Gaza. How many times do we have to do this? We need to resolve these issues. So we've got to find a way. I know Israel desires peace. The Arab world desires peace. We need to work together. We can't turn our back on peace. And I think if I were to say the one thing that we could do that would most help diffuse this, the energy that drives a lot of this illness, the terrorism, the criminality, is the war that has gone on for far too long. We need to reach a peaceful agreement. And if I could, in closing, I think your story about your mom is really special. I was very, Michael, after we talked about this last time I was here, and it was a woman was listening to the radio, and she heard me tell that story. And I got a note, and she wrote me a note, and she says, I think I remember your father. Now, you might think, okay, well, come on. My dad's name was Morrell, and everybody called him Mo. And she said, I didn't say that on the radio. She said, we had a young Marine, his name was Mo, and my husband met him on the streetcar and said, you look far too skinny, young man, you're coming home for dinner. And she said, if nothing else, we help fatten up your father. And so, it shows you, it is such a privilege, it is such an honor, and I am so grateful to the President for allowing me to be the second generation of my family. The only thing that still brings a tear to my eye is I wish my dad had lived to see it. I'm the first generation in my family to get to go to college. I suspect, my dad came back from the war, he worked for a moving company. My mom was an x-ray technician. We lived in a house about the size of many of the houses over here in St. Kilda. And I bet you neither my mom or dad would have ever dreamed their son would grow up to be a United States ambassador, let alone to be United States ambassador to Australia. But I know they'd be damn proud. So I know I am, and I'm going to work very hard to try to do as best a job as I can represent the United States here. So thank you so much for your question and your comments. And we stand by Israel and always will.